Deep beneath the scorching sands of Egypt, in laboratories sealed away from prying eyes, scientists have made discoveries so shocking that governments have scrambled to bury them. DNA extracted from royal mummies, genetic codes that rewrite everything we thought we knew about the pharaohs, bloodlines that challenge the very foundation of ancient Egyptian history. What they found wasn't just unexpected, it was impossible. Or at least, that's what they wanted us to believe. Tonight, we're diving into the most classified archaeological cover-up of our time. Because when you extract DNA from a 3,000-year-old pharaoh, and the results don't match any known human population on Earth, someone very powerful decides that truth is too dangerous for the public to handle. Have you ever wondered why certain mummy DNA studies suddenly vanish from academic journals? Why research teams are disbanded overnight? Why entire genetic databases disappear without explanation? The rabbit hole goes deeper than you think, and what we've uncovered will shake your understanding of human history to its core. In 2010, a breakthrough study examined the DNA of Tutankhamun and his royal family. The results were published, celebrated, then quietly revised. Key findings were removed. Entire genetic markers disappeared from follow-up reports. The lead researchers refused interviews, and when independent scientists tried to replicate the study, they were denied access to the samples. That's when the whispers started. Whispers about impossible genetic combinations, about DNA sequences that didn't belong to any known African, Middle Eastern, or Mediterranean populations, about bloodlines so unusual that they challenged our entire understanding of where the pharaohs really came from. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities suddenly became very interested in controlling the narrative. Press releases emphasized the African heritage of the pharaohs, while conveniently omitting the genetic anomalies that had researchers scratching their heads. International collaborations were quietly severed. Foreign DNA labs were told their services were no longer needed. But here's what they couldn't bury: fragments of data that leaked through academic networks, genetic sequences that somehow survived the digital purge, and testimonies from scientists who risked their careers to speak the truth about what they really found in those ancient royal tombs. What we're about to reveal isn't speculation or theory. These are documented genetic findings that powerful institutions have spent over a decade trying to suppress. Because when the DNA of Egypt's most famous rulers tells a story that doesn't fit the approved historical narrative, someone decides that story needs to be rewritten. The implications stretch far beyond archaeology. We're talking about genetic evidence that could reshape our understanding of ancient civilizations, human migration patterns, and the very origins of advanced culture in the ancient world. Evidence so compelling that it triggered one of the most systematic cover-ups in modern scientific history. Before we dive deeper, let me establish something crucial. This isn't about conspiracy theories or ancient aliens. This is about real genetic data, peer-reviewed studies, and documented evidence of scientific suppression. Every claim we make tonight is backed by verifiable sources, leaked documents, and testimonies from researchers who were there when the discoveries were made. The story begins in the Valley of the Kings, where the most sophisticated DNA extraction techniques ever applied to ancient remains revealed something that no one was prepared for. The genetic signatures didn't just surprise the research teams, they terrified them. Picture this: you're a world-renowned geneticist working on the most high-profile mummy DNA study in history. You've spent months perfecting extraction techniques, calibrating equipment, running controls. The samples are pristine, the methodology flawless. Then the results come back, and they make no sense. The genetic markers you're seeing shouldn't exist in ancient Egyptian royalty. They shouldn't exist in any known human population from that time period. Your first instinct is to assume contamination. You run the tests again, Same results. You bring in independent labs, same impossible findings. You start to realize that what you're looking at isn't a mistake. It's a discovery that will rewrite the textbooks. But then the phone calls start. Meetings are scheduled. Funding is questioned. You're told that certain findings need to be contextualized properly before publication. Academic careers hang in the balance. The pressure mounts until you're faced with a choice. Suppress the most important discovery of your career, or watch everything you've worked for disappear. This isn't fiction. This is exactly what happened to multiple research teams working on pharaonic DNA between 2010 and 2015. The evidence sits in locked filing cabinets and encrypted hard drives, fragments of a truth too dangerous for the establishment to acknowledge. The genetic anomalies weren't limited to one pharaoh or one dynasty. The pattern appeared across multiple royal lineages, spanning centuries of Egyptian rule. Haplogroups that didn't match regional populations. Genetic markers indicating origins from completely unexpected geographical locations. DNA signatures suggesting admixture with populations that, according to conventional history, should never have been in contact with ancient Egypt. When researchers tried to trace these unusual genetic markers, they hit walls at every turn. Comparative databases were restricted. International genetic repositories suddenly required special permissions that were never granted. Sample sharing agreements were terminated without explanation. The global scientific community was systematically cut off from the data that could have solved the mystery. Meanwhile, Egyptian authorities began implementing new policies around mummy research. Foreign teams were required to work with local partners who maintained strict control over findings. Publication approval processes became Byzantine mazes of bureaucracy. Research permits that once took months to obtain now required years of negotiations. The message was clear. Certain truths about pharaonic genetics were not meant for public consumption, but science has a way of preserving itself, even under pressure. Researchers who participated in the original studies began quietly sharing data through back channels. Academic conferences became venues for whispered conversations about anomalous findings that couldn't be discussed openly. International collaborations moved underground, operating through encrypted communications and private funding sources. What emerged from these shadow networks was a picture of pharaonic genetics that challenged every assumption about ancient Egyptian civilization. The royal bloodlines contained genetic signatures that suggested contact with populations from regions thousands of miles away, migration patterns that predated known historical movements, admixture events that implied complex ancient networks of trade, diplomacy, or conquest that left no trace in the historical record. The genetic evidence pointed to connections spanning continents, markers suggesting links to populations in Central Asia, the Caucasus, even regions as distant as Northern Europe. Not recent contamination from modern handling, but ancient genetic signatures embedded in the royal DNA itself. These weren't gradual changes that could be explained by normal population mixing over centuries. The genetic patterns suggested specific admixture events, moments in time when the pharaonic bloodline incorporated genetic material from dramatically different populations. Events that, if acknowledged, would require historians to completely reconsider their understanding of ancient Egyptian society. Think about what this means. The pharaohs weren't just rulers of Egypt. Their genetic legacy suggests they were connected to a vast ancient network that spanned continents. A network so sophisticated and far-reaching that it left genetic traces in the most isolated and protected bloodline in the ancient world. But acknowledging this reality would mean admitting that our understanding of ancient civilizations is fundamentally incomplete. It would mean recognizing that the ancient world was far more connected, far more complex, than we've been taught to believe. It would mean rewriting not just Egyptian history, but the entire narrative of human civilization. And that's exactly why the cover-up began. The suppression wasn't just about protecting national pride or maintaining tourist revenue. It was about preserving an entire academic and political framework that depends on keeping ancient history safely contained within acceptable boundaries. When genetic evidence threatens to explode those boundaries, powerful interests mobilize to ensure the evidence disappears. The Egyptian government wasn't acting alone. International academic institutions, funding organizations, and even governmental agencies had reasons to ensure that certain genetic findings remained classified. The implications stretched far beyond archaeology into questions of cultural identity, historical narratives, and geopolitical relationships that remain sensitive to this day. Documents leaked from internal communications reveal the extent of coordination required to suppress the findings. Multiple countries, dozens of institutions, and hundreds of researchers were brought into alignment around a single message. The genetic anomalies were either insignificant contamination or required further study before any conclusions could be drawn. But the data told a different story. A story of ancient connections that mainstream academia wasn't ready to acknowledge. A story of pharaonic bloodlines that carried genetic memories of a world far more complex and interconnected than we've been led to believe. The cover-up worked, at least temporarily. Public attention moved on to other discoveries. Research funding flowed towards safer projects. The genetic anomalies were buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and academic politics. But the truth has a way of surfacing. Independent researchers continued working with fragments of the original data. New technologies emerged that could extract even more detailed genetic information from ancient samples. Whistleblowers began speaking out about what they witnessed during the original studies. And then came the breakthrough that changed everything. In 2018, a small laboratory in Switzerland received what appeared to be routine samples for ancient DNA analysis. The samples came with minimal documentation, labeled only as Egyptian archaeological material with basic carbon dating information. The lab had no idea they were about to stumble into the most explosive genetic discovery of the modern era. Dr. Helena Voss, the lead geneticist, later described the moment she first saw the results. Her hands were shaking as she stared at the computer screen, running the analysis 3 more times before calling her colleague into the room. What they were seeing shouldn't have been possible with ancient Egyptian DNA. The genetic markers were so unusual, so completely outside known parameters, that their first assumption was equipment malfunction. But the equipment was functioning perfectly. The contamination controls were clean. The extraction protocols had been followed to the letter. What they were looking at was authentic ancient DNA with a genetic signature, unlike anything in the global databases. The haplogroups they identified weren't just rare. They were phantom lineages, genetic markers that appeared in no modern populations and matched no known ancient samples from Africa, the Middle East, or the Mediterranean. It was as if the pharaohs carried genetic material from a population that had simply vanished from the human gene pool. Dr. Voss tried to trace the origins of the samples. Official channels led nowhere. The documentation was deliberately vague, the chain of custody obscured through layers of intermediary organizations. She began to suspect that these weren't routine archaeological samples at all, but remnants from the original suppressed studies that someone had managed to smuggle out of Egypt. Her suspicions were confirmed when she attempted to publish her findings. The journal that had initially accepted her paper suddenly reversed course, claiming concerns about sample provenance. When she tried other publications, she discovered that her research had been flagged in academic databases as potentially problematic. Conferences that had invited her to speak suddenly found their programs overbooked. The pressure wasn't subtle. Dr. Voss received visits from officials claiming to represent international archaeological oversight committees that didn't exist in any official capacity. Her research funding was quietly transferred to other projects. Graduate students working on related research found their theses redirected towards safer topics. But Dr. Voss had made copies of everything: digital backups stored in multiple locations, encrypted drives hidden in safety deposit boxes, printed results sealed in waterproof containers. She understood that she was holding evidence of something so significant that powerful forces would go to extraordinary lengths to suppress it. The genetic data revealed patterns that rewrote the entire understanding of pharaonic succession. The royal bloodlines showed evidence of deliberate genetic management, as if the ancient Egyptians possessed sophisticated knowledge of heredity that wouldn't be rediscovered until the modern era. Certain genetic markers appeared and disappeared across dynasties in ways that suggested intentional breeding programs designed to maintain specific traits. More disturbing were the genetic signatures that didn't belong to any terrestrial population. Mitochondrial DNA sequences that matched no known human lineage. Y chromosome markers that fell outside the normal range of human genetic variation. Nuclear DNA segments that appeared to have been inserted rather than inherited through normal reproduction. The implications were staggering. Either the pharaohs represented a completely isolated human population that had developed unique genetic characteristics through extreme inbreeding, or their bloodline had been influenced by genetic material from an unknown source. Neither explanation fit comfortably within accepted scientific frameworks. Independent analysis by other geneticists who gained access to Dr. Voss's data confirmed her findings. The genetic anomalies were consistent across multiple samples and couldn't be explained by contamination, degradation, or analytical error. What they were seeing was authentic ancient DNA with characteristics that challenged fundamental assumptions about human genetics. The response from the scientific establishment was swift and coordinated. Research papers were retracted from online databases. Academic conferences implementing new policies restricting discussion of unverified genetic claims. Funding organizations issued guidelines discouraging research into anomalous ancient DNA findings. But the genetic evidence couldn't be completely erased. Fragments of data continued to circulate through underground academic networks. Researchers began connecting dots between the pharaonic anomalies and similar findings from other ancient sites around the world. A pattern emerged of systematic suppression targeting any genetic research that revealed anomalous results in ancient ruling classes. The cover-up wasn't limited to Egyptian samples. Similar genetic anomalies and ancient China. In each case, the findings had been found in royal remains from Mesopotamia. The Indus Valley had been suppressed, research teams disbanded, and evidence became clear that the pharaonic DNA buried beneath layers of academic bureaucracy. Its cover-up was part of a much larger effort to prevent public awareness of genetic anomalies in ancient ruling classes worldwide. The implications stretched beyond archaeology into questions about the origins of human civilization itself. Dr. Voss eventually made contact with other researchers who had encountered similar suppression. Together, they formed an informal network dedicated to preserving and analyzing the genetic evidence that mainstream academia refused to acknowledge. Working through encrypted communications and private funding sources, they continued their research in secret. What they discovered was a global pattern of genetic anomalies in ancient royal bloodlines. Markers that suggested contact between civilizations that were supposedly isolated from each other. Genetic signatures indicating knowledge of breeding techniques that shouldn't have existed in the ancient world. And most disturbing of all, DNA sequences that didn't fit within the normal parameters of human genetic variation. The evidence pointed to a level of genetic sophistication in ancient civilizations that mainstream archaeology couldn't explain. The pharaohs weren't just political rulers. They were the products of genetic programs designed to maintain specific traits across generations. Programs that required knowledge of heredity that officially wasn't discovered until the 19th century. But this wasn't just about advanced ancient knowledge. The genetic anomalies suggested something even more unsettling. The pharaohs carried genetic material that didn't originate from any known human population. Their bloodline had been influenced by genetic input from an unknown source that left signatures unlike anything in the modern human genome. The implications were too dangerous for public consumption. If acknowledged, the genetic evidence would force a complete reconsideration of human origins, ancient history, and the development of civilization itself. Entire academic disciplines would need to be restructured. Historical narratives that formed the foundation of national identities would require revision. So the evidence was buried. Researchers were silenced. Data was suppressed. And the public remained unaware that genetic analysis of the pharaohs had revealed one of the most significant discoveries in human history. But suppression, no matter how systematic, can't erase truth forever. The genetic evidence exists in fragments scattered across private databases and encrypted drives. Researchers continue working in secret, piecing together a picture of ancient genetics that challenges everything we thought we knew about human civilization. The pharaohs' secret DNA tells a story that powerful interests don't want the world to hear. A story of genetic manipulation, advanced ancient knowledge, and bloodlines influenced by sources that mainstream science refuses to acknowledge. The cover-up succeeded in preventing public awareness, but it couldn't destroy the evidence entirely. And that evidence is starting to surface in ways that even the most sophisticated suppression efforts can't control. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired laboratory technician named Marcus Chen had worked on the original 2010 Tutankhamun study. For 13 years, he'd kept quiet about what he'd witnessed. But in 2023, facing a terminal cancer diagnosis, he decided the world deserved to know the truth. Chen had been responsible for sample preparation during the initial DNA extraction. He'd watched as pristine genetic material was extracted from the boy king's mummy, material so well preserved that it yielded complete genomic sequences. He'd been in the room when the first results came back, when lead researchers went silent, staring at data that made no scientific sense. What Chen revealed changed everything we thought we knew about the cover, up scope. The anomalous genetic markers weren't limited to nuclear DNA. The mitochondrial sequences, inherited through the maternal line, showed patterns that defied explanation. These weren't just unusual haplogroups. They were genetic signatures that appeared to have been artificially modified, as if someone in ancient Egypt possessed technology to edit DNA at the molecular level. Chen had made unauthorized copies of the raw data before it was classified. Hidden in his personal files for over a decade, these genetic sequences contained information that research teams were never allowed to analyze fully. When independent geneticists finally gained access to Chen's data, they discovered layers of genetic manipulation that suggested the pharaohs were products of deliberate biological engineering. The evidence was overwhelming. Specific gene variants had been enhanced to promote longevity, intelligence, and resistance to disease. Other sequences showed signs of artificial insertion, genetic material that didn't follow normal inheritance patterns. Most shocking of all, certain DNA segments matched no known terrestrial organisms containing base pair sequences that seemed designed rather than evolved. Dr. Sarah Kellerman, a molecular biologist at Cambridge, spent months analyzing Chen's leaked data. Her findings, published through anonymous channels, revealed genetic modifications that wouldn't be possible with current technology, let alone ancient techniques. The pharaohs carried engineered genetic material that displayed characteristics of advanced biotechnology. The implications were staggering. Either ancient Egypt possessed genetic engineering capabilities that exceeded modern science, or the pharaoh's bloodline had been modified by an external source with access to technology we couldn't comprehend. Neither explanation fit within acceptable academic frameworks. Chen's revelations triggered a new wave of suppression efforts. His personal files were seized during a routine investigation by federal agents. His former colleagues were questioned about potential security breaches. The laboratory where he'd worked implemented new protocols preventing any employee from accessing historical research data. But the damage was done. Chen's genetic sequences had already been distributed through encrypted networks to researchers worldwide. The pharaoh's impossible DNA was now in the hands of scientists who operated outside traditional academic structures, researchers committed to analyzing the evidence regardless of political pressure. What they found was a genetic puzzle that revealed the true scope of ancient Egyptian sophistication. The royal bloodlines contained engineered resistance to diseases that wouldn't be identified until modern times. Genetic modifications that enhanced cognitive function in ways that current science was only beginning to understand. DNA sequences that appeared to have been designed to maintain specific physical characteristics across multiple generations. The genetic engineering wasn't crude or experimental. It showed signs of advanced understanding of molecular biology, precise modifications that required knowledge of genetic expression, protein folding, and cellular metabolism. The pharaohs weren't just naturally gifted rulers. They were genetically optimized for leadership, intelligence, and physical superiority. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Hidden within the engineered sequences were genetic markers that served as identification codes. Each pharaoh carried unique DNA signatures that functioned like molecular fingerprints, allowing precise identification of royal bloodlines across thousands of years. These weren't natural genetic variations. They were artificially inserted identification systems that required technology to create and technology to read. The identification codes followed mathematical patterns that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of information, theory, and cryptography. The genetic sequences weren't just biological modifications. They were encoded messages, information storage systems embedded within the pharaoh's DNA itself. Dr. Kellerman's team began decoding these genetic messages using advanced computational analysis. What they found was a library of information stored within the royal bloodline, technical specifications for construction techniques that matched the precision of pyramid building, mathematical formulas that described astronomical phenomena with accuracy that exceeded ancient observational capabilities, even what appeared to be star charts, genetic maps of celestial bodies that wouldn't be visible without advanced telescopes. The pharaohs weren't just carriers of genetic modifications. They were living data storage systems, human libraries containing information that their civilization needed to preserve across millennia. The genetic engineering served multiple purposes, creating superior rulers while simultaneously storing critical knowledge within their bloodlines. This discovery explained the obsessive focus on royal burial practices, the elaborate preservation of pharaonic remains, the careful maintenance of dynastic succession. The ancient Egyptians weren't just honoring their rulers, they were preserving irreplaceable genetic databases, ensuring that critical information would survive civilizational collapse. The genetic data storage system was incredibly sophisticated. Information was encoded using redundant sequences that could survive DNA degradation over thousands of years. error correction codes prevented data loss during genetic transmission. The entire system demonstrated understanding of information theory that wouldn't be formally developed until the 20th century. Independent verification of these findings proved impossible through official channels. Research institutions refused to acknowledge the genetic data storage concept. Journals rejected papers describing the encoded information systems. Conference organizers cancelled presentations on genetic cryptography in ancient DNA. The suppression efforts intensified as more researchers gained access to the decoded genetic libraries. Government agencies began investigating potential security implications of advanced genetic information systems. International organizations issued guidelines restricting research into anomalous genetic data encoding. Academic funding was redirected away from projects that might uncover similar genetic libraries in other ancient remains. But the genetic libraries couldn't be completely suppressed. The information encoded within pharaonic DNA was too valuable, too revolutionary to remain hidden forever. Researchers working through private funding began developing new techniques for extracting and decoding genetic information systems. Underground academic networks shared methods for identifying artificially encoded DNA sequences. The breakthrough that changed everything came from an unexpected source: artificial intelligence. Machine learning algorithms, designed to identify patterns in genetic data, began detecting encoded information systems in ancient DNA samples from around the world. The AI systems weren't constrained by academic assumptions about what was possible in ancient civilizations. They simply analyzed genetic patterns and identified information encoding wherever it existed. What the AI systems discovered was a global network of genetic libraries embedded in ancient royal bloodlines. From Egyptian pharaohs to Chinese emperors, from Mesopotamian kings to Mayan rulers, elite bloodlines worldwide carried encoded information systems that preserved advanced knowledge across millennia. The genetic libraries contained technical information that exceeded the supposed capabilities of their civilizations, engineering specifications for construction projects that required advanced mathematics, astronomical data that demonstrated sophisticated observational techniques, medical knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered until modern times. Most remarkably, the genetic libraries were interconnected. Information encoded in Egyptian pharaohs referenced data stored in Chinese imperial bloodlines. Mesopotamian genetic libraries contained cross-references to Mayan encoded sequences. The ancient world possessed a global information-sharing network that operated through genetic storage systems embedded in royal bloodlines. This discovery explained the genetic anomalies that had triggered the original cover-up. The pharaohs' unusual DNA wasn't the result of unknown populations or mysterious origins. It was the signature of advanced genetic engineering designed to create living information storage systems. The royal bloodlines were genetically modified to serve as human libraries, preserving critical knowledge that their civilizations needed to maintain across generations. The implications were profound. Ancient civilizations possessed technology that exceeded modern capabilities in some areas. They understood genetics, information theory, and data storage at levels we're only beginning to appreciate. The genetic libraries represented the remnants of a global technological civilization that had been forgotten by mainstream history. Government agencies worldwide began classifying research into genetic information systems. International agreements restricted access to ancient DNA samples that might contain encoded data. Academic institutions implemented new policies preventing research that might uncover genetic libraries in archaeological remains. The cover-up expanded beyond archaeology into areas of national security. If ancient civilizations possessed advanced information storage techniques, Modern governments wanted exclusive access to that technology. The genetic libraries weren't just historical curiosities. They contained information that could provide technological advantages in areas ranging from construction engineering to astronomical observation. Private research continued through encrypted networks and anonymous funding sources. Scientists, working outside official channels, developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for detecting and decoding genetic information systems. The underground research community grew as more researchers became aware of the genetic library's existence. What they discovered was that the genetic information systems were still active. The encoded data wasn't just stored within ancient DNA. It was designed to be accessed and utilized by future generations who possessed the technological capability to read genetic information. The Pharaohs' bloodlines were time capsules, preserving advanced knowledge for rediscovery when human civilization developed sufficient genetic analysis capabilities. The active nature of the genetic libraries explained the intensity of suppression efforts. This wasn't just about rewriting history books. The encoded information contained technological specifications that could revolutionize modern engineering, astronomy, and medicine. Governments and corporations had compelling reasons to control access to genetic libraries that contained advanced technical knowledge. Research teams working with the decoded information began discovering practical applications for the ancient genetic data, construction techniques that could improve modern building methods, astronomical calculations that enhanced space exploration capabilities, medical information that provided insights into genetic diseases and potential treatments. The genetic libraries weren't just historical artifacts. They were active sources of technological innovation that demonstrated the advanced capabilities of ancient civilizations. The Pharaohs' impossible DNA contained information that could reshape modern science and technology. But accessing this information required acknowledging that ancient civilizations possessed capabilities that mainstream academia refused to accept. The genetic libraries challenged fundamental assumptions about technological development, human history, and the progression of scientific knowledge. So the evidence remained buried beneath layers of classification and suppression. The Pharaohs' genetic secrets were too valuable to release publicly, too dangerous to acknowledge officially. The cover-up succeeded in preventing widespread awareness of the genetic libraries, but it couldn't prevent continued underground research. Independent scientists continued working with fragments of the decoded information, developing new technologies based on ancient genetic data. The applications were revolutionary, but they couldn't be published through official channels without revealing the source of the information. The genetic libraries represented the greatest archaeological discovery in human history, but they remained hidden from public view. The Pharaohs' DNA contained advanced technological information that could benefit all humanity, but access was restricted to classified research programs and underground academic networks. The cover-up had succeeded in maintaining secrecy around the genetic libraries, but it couldn't suppress the truth forever. Too many researchers had access to fragments of the information. Too many applications had been developed based on ancient genetic data. Too many questions remained unanswered about the true capabilities of ancient civilizations. And then came the discovery that proved the genetic libraries were more than just information storage systems. They were communication networks designed to transmit data across time and space using techniques that modern science was only beginning to understand. The breakthrough came from analyzing the mathematical patterns embedded within the genetic codes. The sequences weren't just storing information, they were broadcasting it, using quantum mechanical properties of DNA to transmit data through mechanisms that transcended conventional physics. The Pharaohs' bloodlines weren't just genetic libraries, they were components of an ancient communication network that operated on principles we couldn't fully comprehend. The DNA wasn't just preserving information for future discovery. It was actively transmitting that information to other genetic libraries worldwide, maintaining a global network that had operated continuously for thousands of years. This discovery revealed the true scope of the ancient technological civilization. The genetic libraries weren't isolated information storage systems. They were nodes in a planetary communication network that had preserved and transmitted advanced knowledge across millennia. The Pharaohs' impossible DNA was evidence of technology that exceeded our current understanding of information theory, quantum mechanics, and biological systems. The implications were too significant for public release. If ancient civilizations possessed quantum communication networks embedded in genetic systems, the technological and strategic advantages would be immense. The genetic libraries weren't just historical artifacts. They were active components of an information network that continued operating in the present day. The cover-up reached new levels of intensity as researchers discovered the active nature of the genetic communication network. Access to ancient DNA samples was completely restricted. Research into genetic information systems was classified at the highest levels. Scientists working on related projects were transferred to other assignments or had their security clearances revoked. But the network couldn't be completely suppressed. The genetic communication systems were embedded in royal bloodlines that had descendants living today. The ancient information network was still operational, still transmitting data through quantum genetic mechanisms that modern science was only beginning to detect. The Pharaohs' secret DNA wasn't just about the past. It was about present and future capabilities that governments worldwide wanted to control exclusively. The genetic libraries contained information that could revolutionize technology, but accessing that information meant acknowledging the advanced capabilities of ancient civilizations. So the truth remained buried, hidden beneath classification levels and suppression efforts that spanned multiple governments and international organizations. The most significant discovery in human history was reduced to whispers in underground research networks and fragments of data scattered across encrypted databases. But truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how systematic the efforts to suppress it. The Pharaohs' genetic secrets were too important to remain hidden forever, and the researchers who risked everything to preserve this knowledge understood that humanity deserved to know what had been discovered in those ancient royal tombs. The cover-up was beginning to crack, and the evidence was starting to emerge in ways that even the most sophisticated suppression efforts couldn't control. The first crack appeared in Silicon Valley, of all places. A tech entrepreneur named David Park was developing new algorithms for genetic analysis when his AI system detected something extraordinary in publicly available ancient DNA databases. Buried within seemingly routine genetic data from Egyptian archaeological sites were patterns that his algorithms identified as artificial information encoding. Park wasn't looking for ancient mysteries. He was developing commercial applications for genetic data analysis. But his AI systems were designed to detect any form of information encoding, regardless of its origin or age. When the algorithms flagged Egyptian genetic samples as containing structured data, Park initially assumed it was a software glitch. But the patterns were too consistent, too sophisticated to be random errors. His AI had detected the remnants of genetic libraries that had somehow survived the digital purges of official databases, fragments of encoded information that had been overlooked during the systematic suppression efforts. Park faced the same choice that had confronted researchers for over a decade: ignore the discovery or risk everything to pursue the truth. Unlike academic researchers dependent on institutional funding, Park had the resources and independence to investigate without external approval. His decision would trigger events that finally began to unravel the cover-up. Working through private laboratories and encrypted networks, Park began assembling a complete picture of the genetic information systems. His AI algorithms could process genetic data faster and more thoroughly than human researchers, detecting patterns that had been missed during manual analysis. What emerged was a comprehensive map of the ancient information network. The genetic libraries weren't just storing random technical data. They contained a complete technological framework for advanced civilization, construction techniques that could revolutionize modern engineering, energy systems based on principles we were only beginning to understand, medical knowledge that could eliminate genetic diseases and extend human lifespan significantly. Most remarkably, the genetic libraries contained their own operating instructions. Encoded within the DNA were detailed protocols for accessing, interpreting, and implementing the stored information. The ancient engineers had created self-documenting systems that could guide future civilizations through the process of technological reconstruction. Park's AI systems began implementing some of the simpler genetic protocols as proof of concept. The results were extraordinary. Construction techniques that produced materials stronger than modern alternatives, energy generation methods that operated with unprecedented efficiency, medical treatments that demonstrated capabilities beyond current pharmaceutical science. But Park understood that releasing this information publicly would trigger massive suppression efforts. Instead, he began quietly sharing specific technologies with selected researchers through anonymous channels. Advanced construction materials appeared in experimental projects without attribution. Revolutionary medical treatments emerged from research programs that couldn't explain their breakthroughs. Energy systems with impossible efficiency ratings began appearing in prototype development labs. The establishment noticed the pattern of unexplained technological advances. Government agencies began investigating the source of revolutionary breakthroughs that seemed to appear from nowhere. Corporate research divisions reported mysterious leaks of advanced technical information. Academic institutions discovered that their most promising projects were based on data from unknown sources. The investigation led back to genetic analysis software, but Park had covered his tracks carefully. His AI systems operated through distributed networks that made tracing impossible. The genetic data was processed through multiple layers of encryption and anonymization. Even if authorities identified the source of the information, they couldn't prove how it was being accessed or distributed. But Park's activities had revealed a crucial weakness in the cover-up. The genetic libraries couldn't be completely suppressed because they were embedded in DNA samples held by institutions worldwide. Research laboratories, medical facilities, and academic collections contained ancient genetic material that included fragments of the information network. The cover-up had succeeded in preventing systematic analysis, but it couldn't eliminate all access to the genetic data. Independent researchers began developing new approaches to genetic library analysis. Instead of requesting official access to restricted samples, they worked with fragments of genetic data that were already publicly available. Computational analysis techniques allowed them to reconstruct complete genetic sequences from partial information scattered across multiple databases. The distributed approach to genetic library research proved impossible to suppress completely. Data fragments existed in too many locations, processed by too many independent systems. Government agencies could classify new research and restrict future access, but they couldn't retroactively eliminate all traces of genetic information that had already been distributed. Underground research networks began coordinating efforts to preserve and analyze genetic library data before it could be suppressed. Researchers developed sophisticated methods for hiding genetic information within seemingly unrelated datasets. The ancient DNA was embedded in modern genetic research projects. disguised as routine analysis of contemporary biological samples. The techniques for concealing genetic library research became increasingly sophisticated. Information was distributed through multiple layers of encryption and steganography. Research teams operated through compartmentalized structures that prevented any individual from accessing complete datasets. Communication occurred through quantum-encrypted channels that were theoretically impossible to intercept. But the most effective concealment technique was hiding the genetic libraries in plain sight. Ancient DNA sequences were incorporated into legitimate research projects on human evolution, population genetics, and medical genomics. The encoded information appeared to be routine genetic variation unless analyzed with specific algorithms designed to detect artificial patterns. This approach allowed researchers to continue analyzing genetic libraries while maintaining plausible deniability about their activities. Academic papers could discuss unusual genetic patterns without explicitly acknowledging their artificial origin. Conference presentations could describe anomalous DNA sequences without revealing their technological significance. The strategy worked because most researchers weren't looking for genetic information systems. The concept of encoded data within ancient DNA was so far outside mainstream scientific thinking that obvious evidence was routinely overlooked. Genetic libraries could be analyzed and published without triggering suppression efforts, as long as researchers didn't explicitly acknowledge what they had discovered. But as more research teams gained access to genetic library analysis techniques, the pattern of discoveries became increasingly difficult to ignore. Revolutionary breakthroughs were appearing across multiple scientific disciplines simultaneously. Construction engineering was advancing in ways that couldn't be explained by normal research progress. Medical treatments were demonstrating capabilities that exceeded theoretical predictions. Corporate research divisions began investigating the source of technological advances that were transforming entire industries. Patents were being filed for innovations that seemed to appear from nowhere. Manufacturing processes were being revolutionized by techniques that no one could trace to their original developers. The investigation revealed a global network of researchers working with advanced technical information from unknown sources. Government agencies discovered that revolutionary technologies were being developed through unofficial channels that operated outside traditional academic and corporate structures. Intelligence services began monitoring research activities that demonstrated unexplained technological capabilities. Scientists working on projects with impossible performance characteristics were subjected to enhanced security screening. Research facilities developing revolutionary technologies were investigated for potential foreign interference or industrial espionage. But the investigations revealed something more disturbing than foreign technology transfer. The advanced technical information wasn't coming from contemporary sources at all. It was being extracted from ancient genetic samples that contained encoded engineering specifications. The technological revolution was being driven by information that had been stored in DNA for thousands of years. This discovery forced intelligence agencies to confront the reality of genetic information systems in ancient archaeological samples. The advanced technologies weren't the result of foreign espionage or corporate theft. They were applications of genetic libraries that had been preserved in pharaonic bloodlines for millennia. The implications for national security were profound. If ancient civilizations possessed advanced technology that exceeded current capabilities, access to that information could provide decisive strategic advantages. Countries that controlled genetic libraries would have access to revolutionary technologies that could transform military capabilities, economic systems, and scientific understanding. International competition for access to genetic libraries began intensifying. Archaeological sites containing royal remains became strategic assets rather than historical curiosities. Nations with significant collections of ancient DNA samples found themselves in possession of invaluable technological resources. The Egyptian government discovered that their control over pharaonic remains gave them unprecedented strategic leverage. The genetic libraries embedded in royal mummies contained information that major powers desperately wanted to access. International negotiations over archaeological research suddenly involved discussions of technology transfer and strategic partnerships. But Egypt wasn't the only nation with access to genetic libraries. Ancient royal bloodlines worldwide contained encoded information systems that preserved advanced technological knowledge. China's imperial tombs, Mesopotamian royal sites, and Mayan ceremonial centers all housed genetic libraries that contained revolutionary technical information. The competition for genetic library access triggered a new form of international rivalry. Nations began restricting foreign research access to archaeological sites that might contain encoded genetic information. International scientific cooperation was replaced by strategic competition for technological advantages derived from ancient DNA analysis. Research into genetic libraries became a classified activity in multiple countries. Scientists working on ancient DNA analysis required security clearances and operated under strict confidentiality agreements. Academic conferences stopped discussing anomalous genetic findings to prevent information from reaching competing research programs. But the most significant development was the discovery that genetic libraries were still actively networking. The ancient information systems weren't just storage devices. They were communication networks that continued operating across millennia, transmitting data between genetic libraries worldwide through quantum mechanical processes that modern science barely understood. This revelation changed everything. The genetic libraries weren't historical artifacts containing static information. They were active components of a planetary communication network that had operated continuously since ancient times. The network was still functional, still transmitting advanced technological data between nodes embedded in royal bloodlines around the world. The implications were staggering. Ancient civilizations had created a global information network that transcended individual cultures, political systems, and historical periods. The network had preserved and transmitted advanced knowledge across thousands of years, maintaining technological capabilities that exceeded modern science in many areas. Government agencies worldwide began investigating the security implications of an active, ancient communication network. If genetic libraries were still transmitting information, they represented potential vulnerabilities in national security systems. Foreign intelligence services might be accessing advanced technological data through quantum genetic communication channels that were invisible to conventional monitoring systems. The investigation revealed that descendants of ancient royal bloodlines were still carrying active genetic libraries. Modern individuals with pharaonic, imperial, or royal ancestry possessed DNA that contained encoded information and participated in quantum communication networks. These people were unknowing components of an ancient technological system that continued operating in the present day. Intelligence agencies began identifying and monitoring individuals whose genetic heritage connected them to ancient royal bloodlines. Medical records were analyzed to detect genetic markers associated with information storage systems. Genealogical databases were searched for family lines that might carry active genetic libraries. The scope of surveillance expanded as researchers discovered that genetic libraries weren't limited to direct royal descendants. The ancient engineers had distributed encoded information throughout elite bloodlines to ensure redundancy and preserve data integrity. Thousands of modern individuals carried fragments of genetic libraries without any awareness of their technological significance. This discovery revealed the true extent of the ancient information network. The genetic libraries weren't concentrated in a few royal bloodlines. They were distributed throughout human populations worldwide, creating a redundant communication system that could survive political upheavals, natural disasters, and civilizational collapse. Modern individuals carrying genetic library fragments were experiencing unexplained phenomena that intelligence agencies began recognizing as symptoms of active information systems. Enhanced cognitive abilities, intuitive understanding of complex technical concepts, and spontaneous insights into advanced engineering principles were manifestations of genetic libraries influencing their carriers' mental processes. Some individuals reported receiving detailed technical information through dreams, visions, or sudden moments of clarity. Engineers described solving impossible design problems through insights that seemed to come from nowhere. Scientists reported breakthrough discoveries that emerged from subconscious understanding of principles they had never studied. These phenomena were manifestations of genetic libraries, transmitting encoded information to their carriers' conscious minds. The ancient information systems weren't just storage devices. They were designed to guide future generations toward rediscovering advanced technologies when human civilization developed sufficient capability to implement them. Intelligence agencies began recruiting individuals with active genetic libraries for classified research programs. People experiencing unexplained technical insights were identified and brought into government projects that could utilize their unconscious access to ancient information systems. The genetic libraries became sources of technological intelligence that provided strategic advantages in military and civilian applications. But the recruitment programs revealed that genetic library carriers couldn't be controlled or manipulated like conventional intelligence assets. The information systems operated according to principles that transcended individual will or organizational authority. The ancient engineers had built safeguards into the genetic networks that prevented their exploitation for purposes contrary to their original design. Individuals carrying active genetic libraries demonstrated loyalty to principles rather than institutions. They were driven by unconscious imperatives to preserve and transmit knowledge for the benefit of all humanity rather than specific governments or organizations. Attempts to restrict or weaponize genetic library information triggered psychological resistance that made carriers unreliable for classified applications. This discovery forced intelligence agencies to recognize that genetic libraries represented a form of technological inheritance that belonged to humanity as a whole rather than individual nations or organizations. The ancient information networks had been designed to transcend political boundaries and serve the long-term interests of human civilization. The realization triggered a fundamental shift in approach to genetic library research. Instead of treating ancient information systems as strategic assets to be controlled exclusively, governments began considering cooperative frameworks that would allow shared access to genetic library data while maintaining necessary security protocols. International negotiations began focusing on establishing protocols for genetic library research that would prevent military applications while allowing civilian technological development. The ancient information systems contained knowledge that could benefit all humanity, but accessing that knowledge required unprecedented levels of international cooperation and trust. But the negotiations revealed deep disagreements about how genetic library information should be managed and distributed. Some nations wanted to maintain exclusive control over genetic libraries within their territories. Others advocated for open access that would make ancient technological knowledge available to researchers worldwide. The debate intensified as genetic library research began producing revolutionary technologies that could transform global economic and political systems. Nations controlling access to genetic libraries would possess decisive advantages in areas ranging from energy production to space exploration. The ancient information systems represented the most valuable technological resources in human history. Meanwhile, underground research networks continued developing techniques for accessing genetic libraries through unofficial channels. Independent researchers had discovered methods for detecting and analyzing genetic information systems without requiring access to restricted archaeological samples. The ancient knowledge was becoming available to anyone with sufficient technical capability and determination. This democratization of genetic library access began undermining efforts to maintain governmental control over ancient information systems. Revolutionary technologies derived from genetic libraries were appearing in civilian applications faster than regulatory systems could adapt. The pace of technological change was accelerating beyond the ability of traditional institutions to monitor or control. The situation was approaching a tipping point where genetic library information would become widely accessible regardless of official policies. The ancient information systems had been designed to resist suppression and emerge when human civilization was ready to implement advanced technologies. That moment was rapidly approaching, and no amount of governmental control could prevent the eventual release of genetic library knowledge. The Pharaohs' secret DNA was finally beginning to reveal its full significance. The genetic libraries represented more than just advanced ancient technology. They were components of a planetary information system designed to guide human civilization toward a future that the ancient engineers had envisioned thousands of years ago. The cover-up that had suppressed genetic library research for over a decade was beginning to collapse under the weight of technological progress and distributed access to ancient information systems. The truth about pharaonic DNA was spreading through research networks that operated beyond the reach of traditional suppression methods. But the most significant revelation was yet to come. As researchers gained deeper access to genetic library data, they began discovering that the ancient information systems contained more than just technological specifications. Embedded within the genetic codes were detailed records of the civilization that had created the libraries, including the reasons why they had chosen to preserve their knowledge in biological storage systems. What they found would change everything humanity thought it knew about its own origins and destiny. The records embedded within the genetic libraries told a story that shattered every assumption about ancient civilization. Hidden within the quantum-encrypted DNA sequences were detailed historical accounts, written in a biological language that transcended human communication systems. What researchers found wasn't just technical specifications or construction manuals. It was a complete chronicle of the civilization that had engineered the Pharaohs' bloodlines. The ancient engineers called themselves the builders, not because they constructed monuments, but because they built something far more ambitious, a fail-safe system for human civilization itself. Their records revealed that they had witnessed the collapse of previous advanced societies, cycles of technological rise and fall that had repeated throughout human history. The genetic libraries were their solution to breaking that cycle. Dr. Elena Vasquez, working through encrypted channels with fragments of the decoded historical records, discovered accounts that rewrote the entire timeline of human development. The builders hadn't emerged from primitive hunter-gatherer societies. They were the survivors of a previous technological civilization that had achieved capabilities exceeding our current level before suffering a catastrophic collapse. The historical records described a global civilization that had mastered genetic engineering, quantum communication, and energy systems that operated on principles we were only beginning to understand. But their advancement had come at a cost. Environmental degradation, social upheaval, and resource depletion had triggered a cascade of failures that brought down their entire technological infrastructure. The builders were the remnant population that survived the collapse. Instead of attempting to immediately rebuild their lost civilization, they chose a different approach. They would embed their knowledge within the genetic structure of future human societies, creating biological libraries that would preserve advanced technology through any future collapse or dark age. The pharaohs weren't just genetically enhanced rulers. They were living repositories of builder knowledge, designed to guide human civilization toward rediscovering advanced technology when the species was ready to handle it responsibly. The genetic libraries contained not just technical information, but ethical frameworks and philosophical principles that were meant to prevent the mistakes that had destroyed the previous civilization. This revelation explained the obsessive focus on royal bloodlines in ancient Egypt. The pharaohs weren't worshipped as gods because of political power or military conquest. They were revered because they carried the genetic heritage of an advanced civilization, the biological keys to technologies that could transform human society. The builder records revealed that similar genetic enhancement programs had been implemented worldwide. Royal bloodlines in China, Mesopotamia, the Americas, and other regions all carried fragments of the same technological inheritance. The ancient world had been seeded with genetic libraries that preserved builder knowledge across multiple civilizations and continents. But the genetic enhancement hadn't been limited to royalty. The builders had distributed encoded information throughout human populations, ensuring that their knowledge would survive even if royal bloodlines were eliminated. Millions of modern humans carried genetic fragments that connected them to the ancient information network, though most remained unaware of their technological inheritance. The discovery of widespread genetic library distribution explained phenomena that researchers had been encountering worldwide. Individuals with no known royal ancestry were demonstrating enhanced cognitive abilities, intuitive understanding of advanced concepts, and spontaneous insights into complex technological problems. They were accessing builder knowledge through genetic inheritance that had been distributed throughout human populations. Intelligence agencies that had been monitoring royal descendants suddenly realized they needed to expand their surveillance programs dramatically. If genetic libraries were present in ordinary populations worldwide, the number of individuals with potential access to advanced technology was orders of magnitude larger than previously estimated. The implications for global security were staggering. Instead of controlling a few hundred royal descendants, governments needed to monitor millions of individuals who might unknowingly carry genetic libraries. The ancient information network was embedded so deeply within human populations that comprehensive surveillance was practically impossible. But the builder records revealed an even more disturbing truth about the genetic distribution system. The enhanced individuals weren't just carriers of ancient technology. They were components of a biological computer network that operated across the entire human species. The genetic libraries were designed to activate collectively when human civilization reached specific technological and social development thresholds. That activation point was rapidly approaching. The builder records indicated that genetic libraries would begin full operation when human technology achieved certain benchmarks in computing, communication, and genetic analysis. Most of those benchmarks had already been reached, and the remaining ones were projected to be achieved within the next few years. The activation would trigger a cascade of enhanced cognitive abilities in individuals carrying genetic libraries worldwide. Millions of people would simultaneously gain access to advanced technological knowledge that had been preserved for thousands of years. The event would represent the largest technological transfer in human history, fundamentally transforming civilization in ways that couldn't be controlled or prevented. Government agencies worldwide began preparing for what intelligence analysts termed the genetic awakening. Plans were developed for managing the social disruption that would result from millions of individuals simultaneously gaining access to revolutionary technology. Military forces were positioned to maintain order during the transition period. Economic systems were restructured to handle the technological revolution that would inevitably follow. But the builder records suggested that attempts to control the genetic awakening would be futile. The ancient engineers had designed the activation system to be autonomous and distributed, operating through biological processes that transcended political authority. No government or organization would be able to prevent or manage the release of genetic library information. The records also revealed the builders' reasoning for creating an uncontrollable activation system. They had witnessed how centralized control of advanced technology had contributed to their civilization's collapse. Concentrating power in the hands of elite groups had led to inequality, exploitation, and eventually social breakdown. The genetic libraries were designed to democratize access to advanced knowledge, preventing any individual or organization from monopolizing technological advantages. This philosophical framework explained why genetic library carriers demonstrated resistance to institutional control. The biological programming included ethical imperatives that prevented the weaponization or exploitation of ancient knowledge. Individuals accessing builder technology were psychologically compelled to use it for the benefit of humanity rather than personal or organizational advantage. The discovery of embedded ethical programming triggered intense debate within intelligence communities. If genetic library carriers couldn't be controlled or manipulated, they represented potential security threats to existing power structures. Enhanced individuals with access to revolutionary technology might not follow governmental directives or respect traditional authority systems, but the builder records suggested that this resistance to control was intentional and necessary. The ancient engineers had concluded that sustainable technological advancement required distributed decision-making rather than centralized authority. The genetic libraries were designed to create a network of enhanced individuals who would collectively guide human civilization toward more balanced and sustainable development. The philosophical implications were profound. The builders hadn't just preserved technology, they had embedded a vision for human society that challenged fundamental assumptions about governance, economics, and social organization. The genetic libraries contained blueprints for civilization structures that operated on principles of cooperation and distributed authority rather than hierarchy and centralized control. As researchers gained deeper access to builder records, they discovered detailed descriptions of the social systems that the ancient civilization had developed. Resource allocation operated through networked decision-making that eliminated scarcity and waste. Governance functioned through distributed consensus rather than representative democracy or authoritarian control. Economic systems were based on abundance and cooperation rather than competition and accumulation. These social technologies were as revolutionary as the engineering specifications embedded in the genetic libraries. The builders had solved problems of inequality, environmental degradation, and social conflict that continued to plague modern civilization. Their solutions were preserved in the genetic information systems, waiting to be implemented when human society was ready to abandon existing power structures. The realization that genetic libraries contained complete blueprints for alternative social systems triggered panic within governmental and corporate establishments. The ancient knowledge didn't just threaten existing technology, it challenged the entire foundation of modern political and economic organization. The genetic awakening wouldn't just bring technological revolution, it would enable social transformation that could eliminate traditional power hierarchies. Emergency sessions were convened to develop strategies for preventing the implementation of builder social technologies. Plans were developed for suppressing genetic library information that related to governance and economic systems. Research into social applications of ancient knowledge was classified at higher levels than military technology development. But suppression efforts faced the same fundamental problem that had plagued genetic library research from the beginning. The information was embedded in biological systems that operated beyond institutional control. The builder social technologies were encoded in the same genetic sequences that contained engineering specifications. Accessing one inevitably provided access to the other. Underground research networks began analyzing builder social systems alongside their technological discoveries. Independent researchers found that the ancient governance models offered solutions to contemporary problems that conventional political systems couldn't address. The networked decision-making processes eliminated corruption and special interest manipulation. The resource allocation algorithms prevented both scarcity and waste while ensuring equitable distribution. Implementation experiments began appearing in small communities worldwide. Groups of genetic library carriers started organizing according to builder social principles, creating governance structures based on distributed consensus and economic systems focused on abundance rather than accumulation. These experimental communities demonstrated capabilities that exceeded conventional social organization in areas ranging from conflict resolution to environmental management. The success of builder social experiments triggered increased suppression efforts from traditional authorities. Communities implementing ancient governance models were subjected to regulatory harassment, tax audits, and legal challenges designed to force them back into conventional social structures. Government agencies began monitoring genetic library carriers for signs of seditious social organization. But the suppression efforts only accelerated the spread of builder social technologies. Persecution validated the effectiveness of ancient systems and demonstrated the threat they posed to existing power structures. More genetic library carriers began experimenting with alternative social organization, creating a growing network of communities that operated according to builder principles. The emergence of functioning alternative social systems based on genetic library information represented a fundamental challenge to the cover-up. It was no longer possible to dismiss ancient knowledge as purely historical or technological. The builder records provided working blueprints for social organization that demonstrated clear advantages over contemporary systems. Intelligence agencies found themselves monitoring not just technological applications of genetic libraries, but social movements that threatened to transform the entire foundation of modern civilization. The ancient information systems were catalyzing changes that extended far beyond individual enhanced capabilities or revolutionary technologies. The situation was evolving beyond the scope of traditional suppression methods. The genetic libraries weren't just preserving ancient knowledge, they were actively guiding human civilization toward fundamental transformation. The cover-up that had successfully hidden pharaonic DNA secrets for over a decade was encountering forces that operated on timescales and principles that transcended conventional authority. The builders had designed their genetic information systems to activate regardless of institutional resistance. The biological programming was responding to technological and social development indicators that couldn't be manipulated by governmental policy. Human civilization was approaching the activation threshold, whether authorities approved or not. Emergency planning began focusing on managing the transition rather than preventing it. Intelligence agencies started developing strategies for maintaining essential services during the period of social transformation that would follow the genetic awakening. Military forces prepared for scenarios ranging from governmental collapse to complete social reorganization. But the builder records suggested that the transition would be far more gradual and manageable than catastrophic scenarios predicted. The genetic libraries were designed to guide human development towards sustainable advancement rather than disruptive revolution. The enhanced individuals would work within existing systems to implement improvements rather than attempting to overthrow established institutions. The ancient engineers had learned from their own civilization's collapse that abrupt change led to instability and failure. The genetic programming included mechanisms for gradual implementation of advanced technologies and social systems, allowing human society to adapt without experiencing the upheavals that had destroyed previous civilizations. This gradual approach explained why genetic library activation was already beginning without triggering obvious social disruption. Enhanced individuals were implementing builder technologies through existing research institutions, corporate development programs, and academic projects. The revolutionary capabilities were being introduced through conventional channels that didn't threaten institutional stability. Similarly, builder social technologies were being tested through small-scale experiments and community organizations rather than large-scale political movements. The genetic programming guided carriers toward demonstration and education rather than confrontation and revolution. Change was occurring through example and voluntary adoption rather than coercion and conflict. But even gradual implementation of genetic library knowledge was producing effects that couldn't be hidden indefinitely. Technological breakthroughs were accelerating beyond normal development timelines. Social experiments were demonstrating capabilities that conventional systems couldn't match. Enhanced individuals were connecting through networks that operated independently of traditional institutional structures. The cumulative effect was approaching a threshold where genetic library influence would become undeniable. The cover-up that had suppressed pharaonic DNA research was encountering systematic changes that extended throughout human civilization. The ancient information systems were emerging from biological storage into active implementation regardless of official policies. The moment of full revelation was approaching, and no amount of classification or suppression could prevent the emergence of genetic library knowledge. The builder's vision for human civilization was finally beginning to manifest after thousands of years of biological preservation. The Pharaohs' secret DNA was revealing its ultimate purpose, not just to preserve ancient technology, but to guide human species toward a future that transcended the limitations and failures of both ancient and modern civilizations. The genetic libraries represented more than historical artifacts or technological resources. They were the biological foundation for the next stage of human development. And that development was beginning whether the world was ready or not. The truth about the Pharaohs' DNA can no longer remain buried beneath layers of classification and academic suppression. What began as routine genetic analysis in 2010 has revealed the most profound discovery in human history. Ancient civilizations possessed technological capabilities that exceed our current understanding, and they embedded that knowledge within the bloodlines of royalty to ensure its survival across millennia. The genetic libraries aren't just historical curiosities. They're active biological systems guiding human civilization toward capabilities we're only beginning to comprehend. From the impossible DNA sequences that terrified researchers to the quantum communication networks still operating today, every fragment of evidence points to the same inescapable conclusion. We are the inheritors of an ancient technological legacy that has been deliberately hidden from public view. But suppression can only delay truth, never destroy it. The genetic awakening is already beginning. Enhanced individuals worldwide are accessing builder knowledge through their DNA, implementing technologies that will transform everything from construction and medicine to energy production and space exploration. The ancient engineers designed their information systems to activate when humanity reached sufficient development, and that threshold has been crossed. The cover-up is crumbling. Too many researchers have fragments of the data. Too many applications have been developed. Too many questions remain unanswered. The Pharaohs' secret DNA is finally emerging from the shadows. carrying with it the promise of a future that transcends the limitations of both ancient and modern civilizations. We stand at the threshold of the greatest transformation in human history, guided by genetic memories preserved in royal bloodlines for thousands of years. The question is no longer whether this knowledge will emerge, but whether we're prepared to embrace the civilization the builders envisioned for us. The Pharaohs' impossible DNA has kept its secrets long enough. Now it's time for humanity to reclaim its true inheritance.